This is Poehemian Poetry Podcast, and I'm here with Robert Miltner. How are you today, Robert?
I'm fine. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. To start off, can you talk about when you started writing and how the poetic journey was up until now?
Well, that's an interesting question. I never started out to be a poet or even a fiction writer. I started out, when I was about 15, I learned how to play guitar and started a band. And about a year or so into that, I wanted to start writing songs, and I discovered I was a miserable failure at that. I think people who rhyme have an instinctive gift that I don't have. But I was writing a lot of stuff down, and I had one of my good friends' brother was the teacher at my school who looked at some of my work and pointed me in the direction of, he gave me Allen Ginsberg's Howl to read, and some work by Kenneth Patchen. And a lot of that really opened me up to this desire to write, but to find the right venue for that. So I started writing poems, and then learning more about, I've always been a reader, but I hadn't really ever considered reading poems from the perspective of, well, I want to write poems. What do I see in them when I look at them that way? So I guess I would say, boy, some of my early influences were like Bob Dylan, I guess, and that ability to make words do startling, amazing things. And then in college, I started really studying literature and started really, finding my own kind of expression. And I guess that's it. Once I approached this as a craft I wanted to get better at, I really explored the relationship between what I was reading, not necessarily to influence me, but to inform me. I think a lot of writers, when they start write like the writing was 50 years ago, and then where it is at the moment, I guess that was it.
So it seems to me like music had a big impact on your interest in writing as well, huh?
Oh yes, because poetry is music.
Exactly.
It's not set to guitars or pianos. But yeah, it's the musicality of the line and the sound quality of the poetic line, which is so different from the sentence rhythms of prose that have always attracted me. And I think that, I don't know, I write a poem, and then I hit a certain point where I have to start reading it aloud a lot to hear it.
And then what famous poets do you like to read? Or, local poets, anything like that?
Yeah, I read a lot of poets. We live in Northeast Ohio, you and I, and this is a really rich area for poets, not just university poets, but the community poets, and the community reading scene is very, very strong here. And there are two communities that intersect. And so I really like being able to move between those communities and hear what different people are doing. There's a wonderful sense in Cleveland writers of this Northeast Ohio identity that I think is really rich and strong. Other writers that I read Lee Young Lee a lot because of the musicality of his lines. His lyrics are both beautiful poetry lyrics. His poems are almost like song lyrics. They're so absolutely musical. And he's typical, I think, of people who write in a second language. He was in Indonesia and learned English when he came to the U.S. So he hears that in a different way than the native speaker does. I also like Campbell McGrath, who's from Chicago originally, lives in Florida, who is so wonderfully playful with his language. And I guess, boy, my ultimate favorite, the poet I keep going back to all the time, is Pablo Neruda. And I read just enough Spanish to be able to work with bilingual editions, and so I can read it in English and Spanish and try to find the different musics and to try to understand how you move from one language to another without losing the poem. But Neruda is a huge influence on me these days because his sense of being in the world, being fully engaged, as he calls it. You just don't write about your own private life, but your private life in the context of your culture, of your era, of your politics, and then of a larger connection to a world of artists, and his awareness of social class and how that enters into poetry. I don't know anybody who's as richly textured as Pablo Neruda, or constantly filled with discovery and joy.
I definitely have to add those poets to my big list of poets to read. And as a professor of English, what are some of your favorite topics to discuss with students?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that one of the areas I find myself talking to my students about a lot, both in the class and sometimes jumping into the workshop, or just talking to them after class, is finding who you are as a writer. And that's connected to the voice, but even more so before you find the voice, who are you as a writer? What are the things that matter to you? And how do you make the things that matter to you at the heart of your poems, and then ultimately the body of your poems? Mm-hmm. We read other writers, and they become influences, but sometimes we're just kind of sailing along on them. And there's a lot of followers. Someone will write a book of poems, and it's marvelously successful, and then all these imitators come along. And they're imitators because they admire it and they want to learn the craft. But how, after a while, do you look at your influences and synthesize that into something that is originally you? So I try to talk to my students about that, how you explore that. And some of that comes down to, I think, who are the writers you return to, and what are the topics we return to. We tend to write a poem at a time. And I write a poem, and maybe I'll send it out, and I'll write another poem, and I might set that aside, and I write another poem, and I might send that out. And they seem disconnected. But another issue I talk to my students about is the idea that we create this body of work. And if you spread all your poems out on the floor, and you start to gather them around common topics, if we have 100 poems on the floor, pretty quickly there'll be 3 or 4 piles. And those are the things then become the core of our books. Those become sections of a larger book. They become themes that are interconnected and weave together. And starting to discover what the body of our work is has a lot to do with understanding our originality and then where our voice is. I try to stress the idea of understanding the history of poetry so that we don't write something and think we've discovered it. Writers who write very spontaneously and really don't know the history of the beat movement, which was so driven by the spontaneous as opposed to the aesthetic of the highly crafted. So reading the history, reading the predecessors, reading people who were recognized not just as being popular or winning all the awards, but that other group of people who are really the innovators. It's kind of interesting to me. Some of the writers whose work I absolutely love, they're so original, are not the same people who win all the awards. The awards tend to sometimes be given to people who are really successful at doing what is sort of the period style better than anyone else. But it doesn't mean they're really the most influential or the most original of our writers. And I think that's another thing that I tend to stress. Also, go hear poets. Go everywhere you can hear poets. You need to experience that, and then get out there and try your own voice at it. Read biographies of poets. I read a lot of literary biographies because I'm really interested in how poets got to be the people they were. What's in their background? How do their lives shape their work, their experiences? And good biographies will do that. There's a heck of a lot of good ones being written, but not a lot of them being read.
Yeah, and I feel like the poetic history really helps the poet of today create their work, and it's just a very influential and very inspirational kind of thing to look into the roots of poetry.
Oh gosh, yes. That's very true. Very true.
And what advice would you have for a poet who wants to get published? And what did you do to get published?
Find the appropriate place for your work. Mm-hmm. I think I used to do this. I would see a magazine, to be in that magazine, they send them my work and they send it back. Just because I want to be in a magazine doesn't mean my Atlantic, Poetry Magazine. Well, I don't know. I think that there's two kinds of things that are important for getting published. The first is to find places where you're judged, where the decisions that get made about publication are made by people who are your equals and your peers. Many people get their first publications, if they're college students, in college literary magazines.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're at college, your college has a journal, you submit some work, people who take classes with you are the people who judge the work, and that's where a lot of people get started, publishing with local publishers. And there's more and more of that all the time, of course, because with electronic journals or the ability to publish by working on your computer and getting copies at Kinko's or FedEx, is again having your work selected by people who are in your own community, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The number of online journals right now is utterly astounding, and a lot of them are started by people who are a lot like us. Their sensibilities and their aesthetics for their journal, the level of writing skill of people who are they're publishing. So I would suggest to people look at who the journals are publishing. If they're publishing a lot of people who have 5 books and 6 awards and you're a beginning writer, that's not the place for you. Some online journal where somebody's advertising, we're reading for our first issue. We just graduated from college or starting a magazine. Those are the best places. Or look around at other college journals. You can go to Duotrope and just hone in on journals published by undergraduates at colleges across America, and those are really the best places. I think the other thing then too is to understand the kind of work that you do. If you're writing very lyric work, very subjective, then you must be looking at magazines that publish work that does that. If you're writing prose poetry, for example, if you look at a couple issues of a magazine and they're not publishing any prose poetry, that's probably not a good place to be sending your work. But that requires, I think, both of those kind of require taking the time to read around and look for what seem to be good matches, And then I would suggest this to people. Anytime you get published in a magazine, look at the contributors' notes and find out where those people are getting published, and in particular, find out if any of them are editors of magazines. Because if you're published in the same place, that again creates a sense of being equal peers in your ability to submit to a publisher and say, well, we were just in this magazine together. I'm submitting to your magazine, I think, is a way of establishing credentials for that publication as well. So, there's homework involved.
Definitely. You have to be mindful
a little
about
research.
the process. Yeah. And that's some really great advice. Thank you so much.
Oh, certainly.
And you have a book out called Hotel Utopia, which I got to read.
Yes.
Where did you get the inspiration for it?
That's a funny question. I had published a good number of chapbooks before I published my first full-length book. And so many of the poems are selected from chapbooks. The idea for that book came out of a couple of things. One, and I'm working kind of metaphorically. One is that it's a collection strictly of prose poetry. And I had actually decided I was going to start a blog because I thought, I should try a blog. I should see what that's like. And I named my blog Hotel Utopia for some crazy reason. I just liked the title. And wrote 2 entries and immediately stopped it and realized that was a title that was bigger and better for a book because it got me thinking about the idea that a book of prose poems, how do I envision that? They're small squares. They're squares. They're like little boxes. They're like little rooms. And so I began to envision this book as like a hotel, someplace temporary you visit, like reading a book. And so calling it Hotel Utopia then allowed me to fill those rooms with people I admired, ideas that were connected, kind of explorations I was doing, and it gave the book a unity I had been looking for about 2 or 3 years. The book was out in earlier incarnations. So the inspiration for it kind of oddly started as a failed blog that moved over into finding the right name for a project that didn't quite know its own identity yet. And it allowed me to bring together a lot of things that I was really passionate about, as opposed to kind of filling in the book with things that just would fit for aesthetic reasons. And then that went out to some contests, and eventually got selected for one, which was a very joyous experience for me. Very joyous experience. I like the book very much. I'm so proud of it. I'm so happy that New Rivers Press, which is one of the oldest independent presses in the country, and one of the earliest publishers that supported prose poetry, picked that. I mean, I just couldn't believe it was such an amazing match.
I mean, it's great to hear about the background information about this book, because, sometimes you read and you wonder, what did this poet go through to get this all together? It would be an honor if you read me a few of your pieces from this book of your choice.
I'd be glad to do that.
Thank you.
I'd be glad to do that. I'll read like 2 poems, I guess, maybe 3. The first is entitled Greed, a current topic in the country.
Mm-hmm.
When you read about the Wall Street excesses, I just found it kind of interesting that I wrote this a few years ago, and it just seemed really to get more and more current as time went on. Greed. Who can resist it lying there in the mouth, tasting like liqueur distilled from stolen candy? You know its scent. Ripe apples taken from the neighbor's yard, then eaten in the dark. Your hunger for it is the insatiable appetite you save in the avaricious flesh of your lover. Feel it, sleek as a snake's skin, slick as a tongue, hot as a loaded gun. Remember the red crayon your hand pinched from the box and pocketed so you wouldn't have to share it? The desire, the gluttony for color. Greed is as lean as a skeleton's shadow and will change its shape to meet your needs. Go on, it whispers in your ear. No one is looking.
Wow.
Wow.
Honestly.
Imagery. Yeats taught me that. I used to read a lot of Yeats. Yeats taught me that you can discuss any abstract idea as much as you want to, as long as you put in enough concrete pictures for people so that they see the image that you have for that abstract idea.
Yeah, I feel like greed really came to life there. I almost forgot we were talking about greed. It sounded like a person.
Yeah.
Great work. I actually have a request.
Oh, you request? Okay.
Yes. Can you read House Noises at Night on page 21?
Oh, sure.
I really like that one.
That's interesting. Yes, it's actually right in front of me, because I had marked the one on the page next to it. House Noises at Night. This was, I'll give you a little story about this one, because I forgot to mention somebody who had a huge influence on me, and that was Gertrude Stein. I was reading some of the early language poets, Ron Silliman and some of those guys, and Ron Silliman, who was probably one of my favorite literary theorists, talked a lot about Gertrude Stein and the way that she disrupts expectations of readers. And he kept talking about a book of hers called Tender Buttons, which I had barely heard of. And I tracked it down and I read it, and I think it's one of the great unread books in American literature, and certainly one of the most important early books in American prose poetry. And I read it, and then read a bunch of Gertrude Stein stuff, and then over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I just started writing these poems in a different style than I had used before. They were some of my earlier prose poems, and what happened was I suddenly had this quick collection of these and sent it out to the Wit Poetry chapbook competition, and they picked it just like that, which was startling because these poems were like barely done. And this is one of the opening poems in it, and it uses a question and answer approach. House noises at night. How does the foundation sound as it settles? No kiss in the tongue and groove. No wrath as plaster separates from laugh. And here, under these sills, hairline cracks pretend to be fault lines, portending the eventual entry of insect, water, rodent, cold. How cold, how dark is silence? Plumbing lines, sink drains, vent stacks, cold water feeds, slowly corrode, closed like overindulged arteries, highways for centipedes and other drivers in the dark. How deep the insects burrow, the piles of sawdust forming small pyramids. How ragged is anger? With the first disappointment, understanding. With the second, forgiveness. With the third, irritation, like a burr in the sock, no sidestepping. With the fourth or 400th, words loaded like dumb woods. How true is the algebra of emptiness? Doors awkward as first kisses stick at the jam. Dead bolts and strike plates misalign. The night air burgles under the door and over the threshold. What swings, squeaks, the divorce of proper closure.
Well, thank you so much for reading that. Hearing it out loud makes it even more intriguing to me.
Yeah.
I think the question-answer approach is what really draws the reader into this piece. And if you'd like, you can read another one, or however many you
Yeah,
want.
I'll read another one. This is one of the last ones I wrote before I finished the book. I was intrigued with the idea. A lot of my work, a lot of my inspiration actually comes from going to museums and being inspired by painting. You know, we take classes, we get the prompt, we write the prompt, and then when we're not in classes, we look for prompts in life. And for me, going to museums does that a lot. I always take notebooks with me and jot a lot of ideas. And I kind of stepped back from that because when I started wondering, well, how would that work analogously? I've had a couple of painting classes, and I really love it. I mean, I don't do it very much, but the idea that we can just create whole stories out of color. So that was sort of my attempt in this poem to strictly use color to tell a story and to weave it into an action. So this piece is entitled Accidents. Gray was the truck cab, black its body. Yellow, the taxi in front. Red, the surround traffic signal. The tomato-faced driver eyed his watch, behind schedule with green dreams of money and lust's blue fantasy. For him, the traffic signal was still a singing canary. For the man and the woman, the light had changed. Neither could stop thinking about what he had said to her that morning. Their fingers brushed. She took his hand in the rain at the crosswalk at that hour. The truck was blacktop, macadam, raven, crow. Then the umbrella slipped from her grip. Then her face was waxen in the green light, his face burnt umber turning to raw sienna. Silver from the street lamps splayed on the pavement. Red from the traffic light ran across the wet asphalt.
Excellent. I think the color usage is what I like because I'm a painter and a poet, so it's just a piece of
It's a fascinating experiment. It's really cool to do.
Yeah,
Everyone
definitely.
try it. We don't use color enough in our poems. We see the color in our imagination. We don't always get that color on the page. And that's a really interesting thing I was working on. I work on actually when I put my manuscripts together, whether they're chapbooks or this one, is to try to identify what are the colors of this book? What are the dominant colors? Is it monochromatic? Are the dominant colors peaceful blues and greens, or are they edgy reds and fast yellows? How does that affect the feel of the book when those colors keep showing up in different places? We writers should gain a lot by studying the other artists.
Definitely. And also, it's a good question to ask before you send something to publish. It'd be like, what color is my anthology?
Yeah, and we can add to that, because there's other dimensions of that. What is its what are its dominant kind of collection of emotions? What are sort of the dominant 3 or 4 images that keep recurring? What is is it a book that has a lot of action verbs or a lot of passive verbs? I think that finishing a collection is like finishing a poem, where we do the careful revision, we check everything. How does it open? How does it close? What are the movements within the poem? What are the images and colors? And to take that set of questions and extend those over a book as a whole makes the book tighter and more unified, and it creates a conversation between the poem, reading a poem and turning a page, and reading a poem and turning a page. Kind of like reading a magazine where different people are doing the different poems. But when it's our book, how do all those pieces connect with one another in a way that stitches them together? That's something I've kind of learned along the way that I do in poetry classes where I have the students write a chapbook at the end of the class. These are the kind of questions we bring to it. It's the same revision questions for the individual poem and be used to revise the body of work into a unified whole. Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of valuable advice in your words, and I really appreciate what you're sharing with
Oh,
me.
certainly. Thank you. Thank you.
And to close this up, are there any shout-outs you would like to give out to publications or people that have helped you along the way on your poetic journey?
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. I'd have to thank a couple of publishers who've been very good to me. Jennifer Bosveld at Pudding House, who published some of my early books. Nick Poetry Center, New Rivers Press that published Hotel Utopia, Plan B Press in Virginia that published a chapbook for me. Sammy Greenspan at Cattywampus Press, who has published one of my more recent books, Queen Mab and the Moon Boy, which was a fun book. All Nations Press in Virginia, which has done one of my chapbooks, because I have a new chapbook coming out from them, Imperative. I love the title.
Me too.
And that'll be coming out, I think, this fall. Individual people, that's a great question. I've had so many good teachers and people who guided me. I'd have to say that one of the really important influences for me as a writer was the Cleveland Poetry Center, Cleveland State University, monthly poetry workshops that I used to attend. I don't have an MFA, but I used to go down there very, very regularly when Alberta Turner was running that, and she gave me some of the best advice that anyone ever gave me. Oftentimes, one was, don't hurry the poem. Don't hurry the poem. Don't do more than it needs to do. Try to keep your focus on it. And she also taught me a lot about the fact that we and me in particular, but a lot of us tend to overwrite the poem. And she would always kind of work about 5 or 6 lines back and draw a line and go, oh, the poem ended here. What are you going to do with the stuff that goes beyond it? And she taught me something really interesting. And she said, whenever you do that and you overwrite the poem, what you take out at the end of the poem should either go to the beginning or your title is in there. Really interesting. And she also used to talk about sometimes we had the gift of 2 poems. You'd start one poem and another poem would show up in it. So it wasn't that we were just off on a tangent. It was just that 2 ideas started to compete. Sometimes you wanted to divide the roots and plant 2 poems. So I'd have to really, I guess, shout out to that. And Northeast Ohio has such a rich and supportive community of writers that I think I have to thank everybody who's hosted reading, or I've gotten to read with, or had an open mic, or just people I've met along the way that we talk and share with, because this is a great place to be a writer. It's a great time to be a writer, but Northeast Ohio is a great place to be a writer. And I'm really, really happy to be be here with so many good friends and people whose work I admire and whose company I enjoy. We're all working for the same good thing, which is to put art in the world. Boy, we need a lot of it. We need a lot of it.
Yeah, it's exciting to be in Northeast Ohio. I'm so blessed, and I'm sure everybody can agree who is an artistic type. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great time talking to you about poetry. I'm sure a lot of the listeners are going to get a lot out of this, so thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for asking me to do this. I guess if I have any parting thoughts for this is to suggest to people that if you're not writing, you should do it, because it's one of the last original things we get to do in this world is to be artists. And if you're writing, I guess the final piece of advice I give is something I read by William Faulkner one time that has never, ever left me. Faulkner once said, "Don't ever try to be better than anybody else. Just always try to be better than yourself."
I love that.
And I love that,
yeah.
Because that's always the challenge. How this thing I'm working on now, how does this make me a better writer than I did in the last piece, or by trying another genre even? Gosh, so thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
The neon glow of the strip mall, streets away, signals a false dawn. Traffic strings along the road, headlights still on, illuminating the street. In the thin milk of the first light, church bells ring blocks away. Tones of tin and iron, steel and